Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Patient-Reported Outcomes as Endpoints in Oncology Trials and Marketing Claims, an FDA EMA Perspective. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, please contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Mapi Research Trust, who developed the content for this presentation. Mapi Research Trust is a nonprofit organization that promotes the use of clinical outcomes assessments, COAs, in health research and practice, and encourages exchanges of patient-centered outcomes and COA information amongst academics, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare organizations, and health authorities. With the web-based platform ePROVIDE that includes the databases ProColid, ProLabels, and ProInsight, Mapi Research Trust has become the preeminent source of reliable, up-to-date, and comprehensive information about COAs. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Nadine Kraft is the team lead of Mapi Research Trust's database unit. Prior to her work with the DB unit, side by side with her studies, she worked in an international medical technology company and assisted in the development of an outcome assessment. At the University of Salzburg, she graduated with an MSc in psychology and specialization in cognitive neuroscience and psychological diagnostic, including psychometric properties. And Dr. Roya Sharifat is a physician scientist and epidemiologist. She has worked in academic clinical research for more than a decade, designing and conducting interventional and observational studies in the field of cardiovascular health and obesity. Her recent work focused on psychometric properties and implications of incorporating patient-reported outcome measures in quality assessment tools in value-based healthcare. She is currently leading the scientific activities at Mapi Research Trust in providing support and access to clinical outcome assessment tools and dissemination of patient-reported outcomes. Without further ado, though, let's go ahead and hand things over to our first speaker today. Dr. Roya Sharifat, you may begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Ryan, for your kind introduction. And hello, everybody. And thank you for being here today on our talk over the patient-reported outcome and its role in oncology drugs claims, a perspective from the FDA and EMA agencies. Before I start, I wanted to give a thank you to my colleagues, besides Nadine Kraft, who helped us on the analysis and putting together these presentation, Sandra Desroul and Céline Devinglaise, both are our colleagues from Mapi Research Trust from the office. Before we start, I think it would be interesting to have a look at the, at the participant in this webinar, whether or not you have worked with COAs before. So I'd like to hand the poll to Ryan.
Yes, thank you very much. So this poll should be appearing on everyone's screen at this time. You can participate by selecting on one of the answers you see in front of you and then click submit. The question as posed is, have you already used COA in your own work before? Your answer options are yes in clinical practice, yes in commercial research, yes in academic research, or no, I have not. It looks like most of you have submitted a vote, so thank you very much for participating. Let's look at the results here. We have 62% of you selecting yes for commercial research, 15% for academic research, 13% at clinical practice, but then 11% for no, you have not. Thank you very much for your participation. Roya, it's back to you.
Thank you very much. That's obviously very interesting. So it seems that most of the participants have used COA in their work, and a lot of participants come from commercial research. And it would be interesting also to see if you have submitted any applications before in any of these agencies, the FDA, EMA, or any other agencies. So Ryan, if you could just capture the poll.
Yes, thank you very much. So as with the previous poll, please select one of the answers in front of you and then click submit to get your participation in. Again, the question is, have you ever submitted applications for new drug approvals to these agencies? Yes, the FDA, yes to the EMA, yes to other regulatory agencies, or no, you have not. Looks like we have most of our answers in, so let's look at our results for this one. We have 68% of you saying no, you have not, 26% for yes to the FDA, and then 2% for the EMA, and then 4% at other regulatory agencies. Very interesting. Thank you very much for your participation. Roya, I hand it back to you.
Well, indeed, the results are very interesting, and it seems that most of the people on this webinar would have something new to hear about the EMA, and also a comparison between different approaches of these agencies. And I hope that this webinar would guide you in your clinical research and thinking about submission of your molecules or drugs in the future. So uh, I'm going to start with just an overview of the convergence among EMA and FDA in drug approval as a whole, and then speak about the objectives of today's seminar. I'll move on to describe the methodology that we used for the analysis of the claims, and I'll hand the presentation to my colleague to speak about the ePROVIDE, which is the source of our data for today's analysis. Then I'll move on to the findings, focusing on the claims and then on the guidelines from different agencies. And we'll wrap it up with the updates that have been yeah, posted by the agencies in recent years, and for the FDA it was just a few months ago, and present with the final remarks. So the question of whether or not the EMA and FDA have similar approaches for drug approval is not a new question. As a matter of fact, there is some previous research that has shown high level of convergence actually in new drug approval overall for all of the drugs between these two agencies, particularly one study by Keshoke that looked at the new drug applications between 2014 and 16. And although they reported high level of convergence, they identified that with regards to capturing patients' perspective as a clinical endpoint, the two agencies take different approaches. And other researchers also focused on patients' voices and capturing patient-reported outcome in labeling claim. For instance, there's a study from Demuro that looked at drug approvals between 2006 and 2010 in the two agencies, and they have pointed out that there are differences between the FDA and EMA, especially with regards to the high level of approval, including quality of life instruments at the EMA, which is not seen in the FDA drug approval. But for the most part, these researchers had a very narrow period of time to look at. And of course, there are different approaches to look at the PROs and COAs in general. So the question remains that for the oncology and for the whole spectrum of multiple years of drug approval, whether or not these agencies have shown more congruence, and whether or not the guidelines reflect that differences or similarities. So I should also mention that besides oncology, the rare disease therapeutic area have been mentioned as another therapeutic area that the two agencies have shown differences in their approval processes. So the objective of the analysis that I will share with you today was to demonstrate the current use of COAs in general, and then focus on the PROs as endpoints in oncology clinical trials, comparing the FDA approvals to the EMA, and also to give you an overview of most popular concepts and instruments within the patient-reported outcome field. Again, comparing the two agencies, we take a case of breast and prostate cancer to focus on particular instruments that have been used. And finally, we will review the recommendations of the two agencies in this area. So for a quick review of methodology, we used ePROVIDE database from Mapi Research Trust to review the drug labeling and the guidelines related to oncology. There are 3 databases in ePROVIDE, which my colleague Nadine Kraft will speak about them in a few minutes. Just to give you a very general overview, we use the ProLabels database to capture frequencies of use of COAs as endpoint measures in oncology and overall in all therapeutic areas. And then we focused on labeling claims on approved medical products. Then we move to looking at ProInsight, which is another database, looking at the regulatory environment and capturing recommendation for COAs in oncology. And we will present you with a final critical appraisal. So with that description, I will give the presentation over to my colleague Nadine Kraft to show a brief demonstration of the database and the methodology that is supporting the database. Ryan, could you please hand it over to Nadine?
Thank you so much, Roya and Ryan. You should all see my screen now. And I would just want to start by thanking you all for participating today. And on my side, I will show you, as Roya mentioned, a search in ProLabels and ProInsight in ePROVIDE. So I will start with a very brief overlook of the 3 databases, which are updated and filled on a daily basis. And then we will have a look on how you can use our advanced search to address your research question. We will be starting by ProInsight, and in ProInsight, we are summarizing recommendations and mentions of COAs in clinical trial guidelines from FDA, EMA, NICE, as well as other international agencies which are listed in our About page. And we are producing reviews and new guidelines that are updated within 1 month after the publication from the agencies in ProInsight. Then we have ProLabels, and in ProLabels we are describing labeling claims that are approved by FDA and EMA, And these labeling claims need to have at least one concept that is measured with a COA. ProLabels is a comprehensive database and is describing all the drugs approved by FDA and EMA dating back to 1939, as soon as we have a COA mentioned. And for our extraction, I just want to specify that we are using the label as a main document, and we can add additional data to specify the method of assessment from the medical review or the assessment report. Also in ProLabels, similar to ProInsight, we can ensure that the data which is published by FDA or EMA will be implemented in the database within 1 month. Our last database is ProCollit, and in ProCollit, and our biggest database in ProCollit, we are showing, among other information on the copyright, the languages, and the versions of COA instruments, and we are also describing the development and validation of these instruments. Now I want to move to the advanced search. And in the advanced search, I will show you how you can address your research question. In our case, we will have a look at what we did before the data analysis, in fact, and we will have a look at the landscape of drugs approved in oncology. And we will have a closer look into the examples for breast and prostate cancer. You can now see our advanced search filters, and I will start by choosing our database ProInsight, because we will have a look into the guidelines that are in the database for our therapeutic indications. Here I will choose any guideline that is generic for neoplasms. I also want to see the guidelines that are specific for prostatic neoplasm, and I'm also searching for the guidelines for breast neoplasm. You can see that we will not have a result for the breast neoplasm guidelines. This doesn't mean that they are not existing, it just means that they didn't have any COA recommendations. I'm submitting my search. On the top, you can see that we have a little recap of the filters that we applied. You can see the results. And on the left side, you can see that we have refined by options, which are more specific filters that are adapted to the content of the database. Here you can see that you can filter, for example, for the class of concept, the concept of interest, the guideline status, the agency, the endpoint positioning, date of publication, or a specific instrument. In our case, we will filter for EMA and FDA, because as we heard before, we are focusing on this today. Here, I just want to show you the results that you are getting. So you will get an information about the agency who published the document, the full title, the status and the date, the therapeutic indications that are mentioned, and as well the type of outcome assessments. I will now change my search to ProLabels. So I will clear all my filters, and then I will select ProLabels as a database. And I will again choose our therapeutic indications. For the therapeutic indications, I just want to specify that we are describing the therapeutic indications according to the mesh. This is why I'm searching for neoplasm and not, for example, for oncology. I'm submitting, and we can again see the recap of our results at the top. And you can now see that the refined by options changed because they are adapted to the content in ProLabels. You can now filter for class of concept, the concept of interest, the drug status, the agency or the sponsor, endpoint positioning, a reference number, the drug approval date or the date of COA results, or as before, a specific instrument. In our case, we will, for example, filter for EMA. You can see that we get the update on our recap of the filters, and we will have a look into this example. So if you want to see all the indications for which the drug was approved, you will just click on the little box here. You see the indications for which the drug was approved, as well as all the concepts of interest that were measured and the type of outcome assessment that was used for this. I would like to show you the indication prostatic neoplasm, and then opening the study. Here you can see that each study will be sorted by COA results. Then we are showing the design of the study, and we describe the endpoints with their positioning. Now we just want to have a brief look into one example. So I'm showing you a secondary endpoint which measured the concept of interest quality of life. We have the endpoint definition, we have the type of outcome assessment, and the method of assessment. In the method of assessment, you can see that we are specifying the source. This is what I had mentioned before. So we are taking and using the label as the main source, but we can take additional documents, as for example, the assessment report, to gather more details on the method of assessment. You can also see that there is a link to PROCOLID. If we're clicking on this link, we land directly on the PROCOLID page. And there is another way to see the links to PROCOLID and also the links to ProLabels, which I will show you now. When we're scrolling over the pharmacology and the application details, we can see that at the very bottom of the page, we can see the links to ProInsight, which are coming through the therapeutic indication, meaning that we have 3 guidelines that were published for the therapeutic indication prostatic neoplasm. And we can see that in this concrete clinical trial, for the labeling claim of Taxotere, there was one instrument mentioned, and this is the one that we saw before. So clicking on the link, we will end up basically in the results for PROCOLID. And here I would just like to tell you that this is basically a first search that you can do and that we conducted as well. The analysis of our data is based on exports, and we would just want to encourage you that you can have a search here and you can already visualize the results with a subscription to the databases. But if you would want some assistance and help in the analysis of your data, you can submit a request. And the targeted literature review team who is dedicated to this will contact you. And with this, I would like to hand over back to Roya, who is working for the targeted literature review team and who will show you the analysis that we concretely conducted. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Ryan, if you could please send me the link to share my screen again.
Yep, we are currently seeing your screen.
Oh, you are.
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. So let's move on to the findings. We first go over the claims. And I would like to start with an overall view of all therapeutic areas. So on the bottom half of this slide, you see the FDA, and the lighter color bar shows the percentage of PROs in labeling claims among all drugs approved for all therapeutic areas in the FDA, which is 20%. And if you compare that with the EMA on the bottom, the light blue bar shows 30% overall presence of PROs in labeling claim, which is higher than the FDA. Another interesting fact that I think it is worth mentioning in this slide is to compare the percentage of drugs approved with PRO claims among all COA claims. So the category of PRO among all different types of clinical outcome assessment tools in the FDA is 56%, and for the EMA is 64%, which is higher but not that much. And we'll compare it, the situation within the oncology therapeutic area, and see the difference. I want to start with looking at the number of drugs approval over the years. We depicted in this slide, the first bar starts with the all drugs approved before 2000 in oncology. And then after 2000, the year 2000, we created bar charts every five years until 2015, which has almost 6.5 year worth of data until today. And it's worth mentioning that some of these time points are important with regards to the new guidelines that have been released. So before I mentioned about the guidelines, I just want to give you an overview of a total of 218 drugs have been approved in the FDA, and 369 sorry, I take that back, in EMA, which is the blue columns, 218, and over 360 in the FDA. So larger number of drugs have been approved for the FDA. If you look at the percentage with COA claims among all oncology drugs, that would be the blue bars for EMA and the purple bars for the FDA. And especially in the EMA, you see this upward trend in inclusion of COA claim into the claims. And for the FDA, the upward trend really starts after 2005. And that has significance because the first guideline in the EMA for the health-related quality of time of life has been released in 2005. Moving on, focusing on the PRO claims, you can see that the trend in the EMA agency is more upward and with a rather leveling off in the recent years. For the FDA, again, after 2009, there is an upward trend, but there was no claims with the PRO in the between the years of 2005 and 2009. There were almost about 30 drugs approved over this period of time. If we look more closely on the categories of clinical outcome assessment and comparing EMA to the FDA claims, you can see that over 50% of EMA claims have patient-reported outcomes, and comparing to 30%, only 30% in the EMA. So you can see that FDA in particular has a more cautious approach in including PROs in oncology claims. And the other category of COA that has been, of interest is ClinRO, that is shown in dark blue here, just as a comparison. But besides mentioning in the claim, it is important to understand where in the endpoint strategy these PRs have been included. So here is what is becoming more interesting. So as you can see, among 87 oncology drugs that have been that have had some sort of PRO in the claims, only 7% of them had the PRO in primary endpoint, while it seems that the FDA has more, allowing PROs to be placed as a primary endpoint in the clinical trials. Now let's look at the concepts measured by PROs in oncology. In oncology. So quality of life and symptoms are the two concepts that have been mentioned in EMA claims far more often than any other concept. While if you compare it to the FDA, those concepts are not as frequently, included in the claims. But FDA actually has a more variety of different concepts that have been included in the claims. Um, As a case in point, we decided to look into breast and prostate cancer claims as two very prevalent, cancers in both regions, the U.S. and Europe. And here you can see the top 5 concepts and the corresponding instruments in the EMA. So as you can see, between breast cancer and prostate cancer, the majority of concepts are health-related quality of life with different instruments. And after that, we see pain and symptoms that are far less frequently included. Again, this is only 2 types of cancer. Comparing that to the FDA, you can see that pain, patient preference, and tumor progression has been on the top list of the concepts, while quality of life is also included, but it's not on the top of the list. So in general, it seems that the use of COA is on the rise, especially in recent years, and more prominent in the EMA. And number of COAs in labeling claims is higher in the EMA compared to the FDA. And this difference is more pronounced in oncology drugs. But on the other hand, EMA largely includes quality of life and general symptoms, while the FDA allows a variety of different endpoint PROs as claims as PROs on the claims. And also for the EMA, inclusion of PROs as primary endpoint is very infrequent. And I hope by now, after the demonstration by my colleague, you have an overview of how you can use the database at Mapi, the ePROVIDE 3 databases, to research your COAs and PROs and answer your questions and specifics about the instruments. And also drug labeling and other questions. So let's move to the guidelines. In general, our search has found among all guidelines for COAs, we found one EMA guideline for prostate cancer and 4 general guidelines for neoplasm in the EMA environment. And specifically, 3 of the guidelines mentioned a use of PROs. For the FDA, on the other hand, there were more guidelines for the breast and prostate cancer, and there were an overall 5 general guidelines like COA compendium for that were applicable to neoplasm without mentioning specific indication. And 4 of those guidelines specifically mentions PROs. So we have found more FDA guidelines that mentions the use of PROs in general in oncology. And when you look at specific indications like prostate and breast cancer, you will also find a little bit more guidelines in the FDA. And among the guidelines that have mentioned PROs, if we look at the counts of the concepts, you can see clearly that for prostate and breast cancer in the EMA regulatory environment, mostly health-related quality of life and sign and symptoms have been mentioned, and there were one mention of the function. And for the FDA, you can see a variety of different concepts that have been mentioned for these two particular cancers. So FDA in general offers different concepts of interest and guidance. Again, uh, having to look at the specific guidances using mentioning PROs in breast cancer, for instance. For the EMA environment, there's this Appendix 2 to the reflection paper, and this guidance on evaluation of anti-cancer medicinal products in man that mentions use of a health-related quality of life, similarly the symptoms, and one mention of function in Appendix 4 of the reflection paper. That I'll get to it in a minute. For the FDA, we have, you can see that there are different guidances that specifically mention breast cancer and the type of PROs that are included. So let's together look at the general guidance documents for the COA strategy. We start with the FDA, and the recent update of FDA guidance tree on patient-focused drug development has just been released earlier in 2022, and there's a roadmap to develop a fit-for-purpose COA in general. So FDA provides this roadmap and requires all applications to provide documents, showing evidence that all of these, steps have been covered, and the evidence should be documented and delivered to the FDA for consideration. So it starts with a conceptual mapping of the disease, and also the clinical risk and benefits of the treatment modality. And in terms of selecting COA assessment, there are specific guidance on the properties that are required for a COA to be considered as endpoint strategy for the FDA. And if there are no COAs that are found already, that has been validated, there are guidelines for development of the COA, and applying that COA in the clinical trial. There are 8 steps that FDA requires for application: a clear reason for the choice of COA, and specific aspects of concepts of interest that are specific to that population of interest, validity of the instrument, and also FDA mentions the scoring, the bias on the scoring, and appropriate scoring in terms of identifying change in the PRO or COA, and also interpretation of the results that should be valid. On the other hand, look, EMA has released this reflection paper back in 2005 that had a guidance for inclusion of health-related quality of life into the submission of a dossier for drug approval. And as you can see, it only speaks about health-related quality of life. In general, the reflection paper emphasizes that drug approval in Europe is based on the efficacy and safety, and the use of quality of life instruments are optional for the applicant, but if submitted, it requires validation for the specific therapeutic indication, and it requires evidence that most relevant domains of interest are being measured, and robust improvement should be shown in the dossier with evidence of validation. And also the document mentions that health-related quality of life can be included as a primary endpoint, but only as a co-primary endpoint with efficacy endpoints. More recently, the Appendix 2 of the reflection paper has been updated in 2016, and this Appendix 2 is a specific to oncology drugs. But in general, the reflection paper still stays very broad in describing the principles of best practices of including the PROs, and in particular mentions symptoms control and focus of symptoms and functionality as a primary endpoint, specifically in palliative care, and continues to emphasize on health-related quality of life as a PRO that is being considered in the EMA. Unlike FDA, the EMA does not provide specific roadmap to the selection, development, or validation, but mentions that the rationale for use of PRO should be provided, and the definition endpoint and whether or not how the study has been designed in terms of sample size and power with regards to the primary endpoints should be outlined. And it also recommends that if the sponsor wants to use the PRO in clinical trial, it is best practice to consider incorporating PROs early in clinical trial phases. And the reflection paper generally lists the considerations for statistical robustness of the study, and some specifics about the instruments like psychometric properties, timing of measurements, and handling of missing values. It also emphasizes that in multinational clinical trials, the linguistic validity and cultural adaptation should be particularly, clearly mentioned and hashed out. So in general, we see that EMA has more focus on health-related quality of life and symptoms, and stays general when it comes to concepts of PRO. And this is in agreement with what we have seen in our analysis. On the other hand, the FDA allows for the PROs to be included as a primary endpoint if those instruments are meeting the criteria for fit for purpose. The FDA guidance have details for fit for purpose, and includes also a variety of PROs, both in general guidance and in other FDA guidances that are available for particular indications. And that's what we have seen also in our results. both agencies have mentioned concerns about clinical trial design, the bias, generalizability, and the power. And as I mentioned, FDA goes into more details about the concepts of interest and validation. It is important to mention at this point that implementation issues have been reviewed in many of these guidances in terms of integrity of the data, collection of the data, handling of missing values, and also other implementation issues that might rise with the use of ECOAs and ePROs. The agencies have expressed concern about the burden of missing data and also response bias, especially in oncology trials, that a lot of clinical trials are of open label nature and may be a source of some sort of bias. So along other general recommendations are sensitivity to change and clinical meaningfulness, and use of measure of quality of life, specifically in EMA, is very widely recommended as a secondary endpoint. It is important to understand that in the FDA, in the United States, PRO label claims in general, and specifically PRO label claims, can be used in advertising. So that might be give a little cautious to the FDA to be more specific about the concepts that are being introduced and specificity of them. Advertising the labeling claims, it's not practiced in Europe, but the PROs, especially health related quality of life measures, and the findings are very useful for other health technology assessments in Europe, and very widely used in agencies like NICE, in UK for drug pricing and other related policies related to the drugs. And for the clinicians, it's important to have access to such label claims in order to have an understanding of differences between drugs and making recommendations and decisions together with the patients. Finally, I think it is very clear from the findings that regulatory experts and COA scientists should be involved in preparation of dossiers for submission of new drugs to either agencies, and both agencies are emphasizing that the sponsors should be considering use of PROs in very early phases of drug development, because all of these activities take time, especially if there need to be new instruments developed. And for those drugs that are potentially submitted for approval in both agencies, it is wise and recommended that the parallel application be considered from early on in clinical design. So with that, I would like to give the control back to Ryan, and thank you for your attention. And we are available for any questions or further comments that have risen.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. I'd like to invite our audience to continue sending their questions or comments right now for the Q&A portion of this webinar. I'd also like to draw their attention to the handouts module within the GoToWebinar control panel, where you'll find some additional documentation related to today's presentation to download for some further reading. Now, I've already received some questions from the audience, though, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question that I have for you would like to know, what's the difference between a COA and PRO? Are they used interchangeably?
Well, no, actually, COA or clinical outcome assessment is an umbrella term that refers to any instruments that is used to collect uh, outcomes from the patient's perspective, the patient's feelings or experience of the treatment. And it generally has different categories. Patient reported outcomes are the ones that are expressed by the patient and reported by the patient, like when the patient fills out a visual analog scale for pain. Other types of clinical outcome assessments or COAs are clean rows, the observations from clinician, and ops rows, clean rows, and perf rows that are, performance assessment tools that talk about, the patient performing a task like walking a distance or other tasks. So,
Wonderful.
yep.
Thank you very much. Next question that I have for you here would like to know, what are the sources of data collected in PROCOLID? Does it include clinical trial data?
Uh, so, Nadine, would you like to take this question?
Yes, sure. Thank you,
It's your
Roya.
thing. Yeah.
So in PROCOLID, what we are describing, in fact, is the development and the validation publication of the population of development of the original author. And you can find clinical trial data rather in ProLabels.
Okay, very good to know. Thank you so much for that. The next question I have asks if you can just describe again how you have counted the instruments and created frequency tables.
So I'll start answering this question, and then I'll let Nadine to add any more comments. For there is a methodology that I need to clearly actually mention, that as you may have just already know or have realized during the presentation, there might be multiple instruments for each drugs on the claims. So when we speak about presence of a PRO or COA on labeling claims, we are just counting the presence of those COAs in general or PRO instruments in the labeling claim, and we do not count the duplicates. So if, for example, one study for breast cancer, for example, have both quality of life instruments and symptoms and pain instruments, that counts as those are 3 PROs. But in general, when I showed you this slide on inclusion of PROs in drug labeling, those 3 PROs are counted as 1. So presence or absence of PROs on claims would count as 1 in that regard. On the other hand, there's another way of counting, is that when you want to generally look at the whole space of COAs, for example, the instruments that have been mentioned in claims, and then you want to look at the percentage of, for example, PROs or clean rows or other types of outcome assessment tools, then you will count each number of instruments. So if a drug has 3 PROs, you will include them all, because you want to see what proportions of all instruments are within each of those categories. I don't know if there's anything to add. I hope I answered that question.
That was a very comprehensive answer. Thank you so much. The next question I have would like to know, do you have any information on those COAs that were submitted to the US FDA and rejected for labeling claims?
I'll hand it to Nadine. Do you collect the rejected labels?
Yes, I can answer this for the database. And in the database, we're not looking at this data. So in the database, we're really only looking at the labeling claims that were approved by EMA and FDA. So we are not having a deeper look into these.
All right, excellent, thank you. Next, someone would like to know, during your database search, did you take into account RWE use of PROs and their impact on FDA EMA approvals?
So we just look at the the general categories of the COAs as instruments. So based on the whether the instrument is mentioned in included in Procolid, and then following on that, it is also mentioned in the Pro Insight or the labeling claims. Those are included in the analysis.
Excellent, thank you. Next, can you describe categories of COA?
So Nadine, would you like to take that one on?
Yes, I mean, in fact, I think Roya answered this already before with the very first question. So the categories that we're having are performance ratings, clinician rated outcomes, observer rated outcomes, and the patient rated outcomes.
And I have to mention that we update the database normally. We try to keep the database updated based on the latest categorization and recommendations by the agency of experts about how to categorize different instruments.
Fantastic, thank you. Now, does EMA use the fit for purpose definitions?
So in the recent guidelines, so in the guidelines of EMA generally, the fit for purpose is not a criteria for inclusion of the tools. In the in the recent update of Appendix 2 for oncology, they mentioned that they want to get to that point that they have to they could recommend a criteria for fit for purpose, but that is an aspirational goal. So at the moment, the recommendations are, very general and does not provide a roadmap like the FDA does.
Very good, thank you. So what about ECOAs? Are there specific guidance from use of ECOAs?
For ECOA, yes, actually, in general, the guidances on ECOAs are, in terms of psychometric properties and, validity and validity of the concept and corresponding to the concept there are similar to the ECOAs, but there are specific implementation issues for the ECOA, as you can imagine, because ECOAs, or let me just explain for the audience that it refers to electronic version of the COAs. So, there are specific implementation issues in different, in the, capturing, for example, data and the timing of and intervals of capturing data, and but what to do with the missing data. So, and the different instruments, and those specifics are also included in the guidance for the FDA. I also should mention that at Mapi and our sister company Icon, our larger company, there will be another webinar in October, also hosted by XTalks, that will go into the details of EQA use and implementation in clinical trials. So you will probably get more information on that webinar, more detailed information. So I would invite everybody who's interested to also participate in that webinar.
That's excellent. Thank you very much for that and for all of your answers to the questions today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion from the webinar. Now, if we couldn't attend to your questions, though, the team at Mapi Research Trust will follow up with you, or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email addresses that are up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Now, I'm about to send you a link in the chat box, and with this link, you'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan.